and welcome to INGSA's Horizon series. My name is Dr. Andrew Chen. I'm a research fellow at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Marietje Schaake. Marietje is currently the International Policy Director at Stanford University's Cyber Policy Center and International Policy Fellow at Stanford's Institute of Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, as well as the President of the Cyber Peace Institute. Prior to her current roles, she was a member of the European Parliament between 2009 and 2019 for the Dutch Liberal Democratic Party, where she was one of the most influential voices on trade, foreign affairs, and technology policy. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you.
Great. So firstly, during your time as an MEP, you were both heavily involved in international trade and in setting a digital agenda for Europe. Something we don't hear much about is the intersection between these two, both in terms of digital trade and in terms of international regulation of digital systems. So firstly, where do you think we are headed with digital trade, and what should governments be doing in this space?
Well, thanks. I agree that this is really an area that deserves much more attention and also more ambition, because in many ways, trade rules are a really promising path to also deal with questions of how to actually ensure that exchanges of data, commercially or otherwise, are actually, embedded in a system of rules, fairness, protection of people's privacy, and that there's an enabling mechanism that sets clear rules, clear rules of the road for people who want to, offer their services on the other end of the world. And to really benefit from those opportunities, I hope that we will see more engagement at the World Trade Organization, for example, but it requires leadership from countries that believe in a multilateral system. And unfortunately, over the past couple of years, particularly the United States, has been absent in that field, has actually also proactively hindered progress at the World Trade Organization. And so what I hope is that as the need for a rules-based international order to also deal with the digital realm, in many ways, we see quests for how to best do that from the G7 to the United Nations, in the EU, speaking about new coalitions of democratic governments that are going to work together. I think the momentum is there, but trade rules should not be overlooked as an established mechanism that can also overcome challenges between political systems, for example, in the common interest. And so therefore, I hope that there could be, extension of digital trade rules to be anchored more in the multilateral systems that we know.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it makes me think about data sovereignty as a movement that's gaining a lot of popularity, particularly amongst indigenous populations in various countries around the world. And effectively, we're talking about the data about people should probably stay in the country that they are in. But that seems at odds with this world of cloud computing where data is just flowing all around the world. And I noticed that you mentioned the United States as being one of the countries that sort of held back on on engaging on international trade rules, probably because they are one of the largest holders of data and stand the most to benefit from not engaging in these sorts of processes. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about how we bridge that gap between a desire for data sovereignty and wanting to keep data in particular countries or in particular places, and this desire to have data flowing freely between different jurisdictions in order to facilitate digital trade.
Well, I believe the question is really about sovereignty for what and sovereignty of what, because unfortunately, the term sovereignty gets thrown around a little bit too lightly, if you ask me these days. Let me give you an example. We've heard ambitions to have technological digital sovereignty primarily from countries like China and Russia, who have been objecting to an open internet, who have sought to maximize state control, not only over data, but particularly over the people that may use this data to gain access to information that is considered undesirable by the political leadership, that may enable a more critical thinking, more challenging of the status quo. And so this notion of sovereignty has really been an articulation of ambition to retain control by those countries. Now, recently, and I would say unfortunately, we've also heard a lot of talk about European sovereignty, not only when it comes to data, but also when it comes to its role in the world. I think it must be understood as a response to the big breach in the transatlantic relation, a concern among Europeans that maybe European nations, individually or collectively, were unable to defend themselves, for example, in case of an attack, concerns about whether the NATO alliance under President Trump was still, as firm as it should be. But it's also extended into articulations of digital sovereignty as a path forward for the EU. Now, I think that is unfortunate for a number of reasons, because nowhere that more than in the digital realm do we see the type of mutual dependence that this global connectivity, global supply chains has really led to. And so I think a much more realistic but also urgent question is, under which conditions do we want data to flow? So not to say the answer to all risks or the answer to, for example, the effects of information flowing across borders is to retain it and constrain it, but rather to say, hey, we have mountains of data that offer, on the one hand, great possibilities, for example, for research, for the public interest to be served, but they also offer a number of challenges. For example, when it comes to breaches of people's right to privacy, but also when it comes to instrumentalizing data to develop, for example, surveillance systems, that could be used to repress people. And so I would much rather that we speak about data governance and that there's more clear articulation of which kind of handling of data under which conditions. And that immediately pushes the discussion to questions of data protection, which is something, for example, that the US has not yet arranged on the federal level. And where I hope that between the democratic nations of this world, you're from New Zealand, the scope and span of democratic nations is wide globally. And I hope that they can work together to say, we as democracies, we as nations that believe in the rule of law, would propose a governance model that does justice to those values, but that also enables the fruitful public interest serving use of data, including for commercial purposes, but within the frameworks that we believe serve our values and our people. And I think sovereignty is just not the best way forward for that.
Yeah, I guess related to that, and you touched on it towards the end, we often talk about these sort of government to government interactions, but there is a third party, which is corporations. And one of the big challenges with the regulation of digital technologies is that a lot of these technology systems are inherently cross-jurisdictional. I think we see, particularly in this end of the world, that smaller governments feel that they don't have enough power to push back against these tech giants and to set the rules. So recently we saw in Australia, there was a fight between the government and Facebook over their media laws that led to Facebook temporarily banning Australian news sites from being shared on that platform. And there was a lot of collateral damage in terms of other non-news sites also being banned. And this was sort of Facebook showing, this is our power that we can exert against you as Australians if you do something that we don't like. So how can governments sort of address this challenge?
Well, I agree that the outsized and unaccountable power of these huge tech corporations has gone too far, and that the kind of pushing and lobbying that we saw from Facebook in Australia really crossed a new line of sort of brazenness with which a corporation is using its customers as leverage to achieve political goals. And I think we should all learn from that. And I also appreciate the fact that that may have only happened in a relatively small country. I mean, Australia is huge, but it doesn't have a huge population, for example, as compared to the EU or the United States. And it's a sign that we should take seriously. And so Again, here I believe that there is enormous benefit for relatively small countries. I mean, I'm from the Netherlands, so I know what it's like to be from a small country, and to see more cooperation, because when democracies use their combined scale vis-a-vis these huge tech corporations that are essentially governing enormous parts of people's lives in the digital realm right now, without the mandate, without the checks and balances, without the independent oversight that we would expect in a democratic system, with, on the other hand, more authoritarian ambitions in their use of digital tools for, you know, state power, whether economic, security, or repressive vis-a-vis the rights of their own populations. And so there is a need for democracies to work together to scale up and to create between them a more level playing field, a set of shared rules that applies not only within borders, so this whole idea of sovereignty, but rather actually extends beyond borders and creates a bigger virtual territory, if you will, of shared rules of the road. And I think it's important that the organizing principle for such a coalition is democracy and a belief in the rule of law, and not, for example, as we hear coming out of the United States sometimes these days, a shared market or set of innovations. So you will hear calls for, let's say, a T10, which could be a varying assembly of nations that have, for example, semiconductor industries, or that have a lot of development in the space of quantum computing or artificial intelligence. And it may sound logical to say, look, you know, if we're all producers of this one industry, let's work together. That's all fine and well. But at the end of the day, it will fragment democracies right at the moment where they need to join together, and where, in fact, it is urgent to pull into a bigger democratic coalition those countries that don't have production of semiconductors, that don't have, you know, any kind of excellence in the space of producing one technology or the other, because they are still part of a market. We see the same vision in Europe, where countries that are not, you know, at the top of the production or development scales are actually considered to be urgent to join and to be facilitated in also, you know, raising the bar, let's say, of their countries and standards. And I think that has to happen between the democracies as well. So to organize around shared values, not around shared advances in technology.
Yeah, so I guess a group that could arguably fit that description is the Christchurch Core, and that's one that's very close to us here in New Zealand. And recently the United States joined that group as well, along with a number of the major social media giants, to try and combat the spread of violent extremist content online. So do you see that as potentially being a model that could work, noting that it is fairly constrained on the subject matter that it can really make any progress on? Or do you view that as being, I guess some people have called it reputation laundering, as if we're being uncharitable, but yeah, do you sort of view it as maybe something that is just kicking the problem down the road because it's not necessarily engaging in the right way?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it is most unfortunate and painful that it took the terrible tragedy of Christchurch for this topic to finally be taken more seriously by the big tech platforms. I mean, there had been a lot of display of violence, including live streaming, including recruitment for violent extremism, whether it was with jihadist motives or whether it was with far-right motives, the latter being ignored for too long. And I think this notion of polarization, radicalization, inciting of hatred, inciting of violence, information shared online leading to violence in the streets has to be taken much more seriously. And it was painful, I think, for those of us who tried to warn the tech platforms for the responsibility they had in drawing moral lines, in taking responsibility for what was posted on their platforms and went viral on their platforms, and the ability to get sort of, you know, pay for play on their platforms, conspiracy theories being shared widely and spreading from the top to the bottom and the bottom to the top. I mean, look at the United States, where the president himself, President Trump, was spreading lies and hatred. And then, of course, unsurprisingly inspired people in the grassroots in return, and so on and so forth. In any case, the lack of taking true responsibility and the lack of liability on the part of big tech corporations is not solved by such a call. And I understand that there are good intentions behind the Christchurch call. I hope it will lead to a better dialogue, but I do understand the people who caution that this kind of self-regulatory mechanisms without hard definitions, without hard mechanisms of enforcement, with a lot of outsourcing essentially of decision-making back to the very tech platforms that created the business models that are problematic in the first place, is not a sustainable solution. And so if you believe in the rule of law, that's what I want to come back to, then you don't really want to give these governance powers to tech platforms. Then you would actually really want the agency, the responsibility, the accountability to be a public one, to be a democratic one, and to be an independent one. And so this is where I think we need to go. And so if the Christchurch call ends up being a step in the right direction, fine, but it, in my opinion, can never be an end destination.
Yeah, I think that's very important, because it does remind me about issues like Facebook banning Trump, which was subject of a recent set of decisions, if you can call them decisions, by the Facebook Oversight Board. And I think at the time when that decision was made, there was a lot of debate about whether or not corporations should be empowered to make these decisions themselves, or if sort of free speech can only ever really be controlled by the state. And one of the arguments at the time that I sort of kind of agreed with was that in a world where governments seem unable to act or unwilling to act to regulate these social media giants or these tech giants, and you know, it could be an unwillingness because they're being lobbied, it could be an inability because they lack the capacity, or whatever other reason, then doesn't the sort of moral obligation fall to the tech companies to self-regulate in that sense and to take action because the governments aren't going to?
Well, let me try to peel your question a little bit, because there's a lot in there. One, there is nothing that holds big tech corporations back from drawing strong moral lines, from saying, you know, we do not want to invite to our private club online Holocaust deniers, or Proud Boys type militias, or LGBTQI discriminating groups, or you know, advertisements for Nazi memorabilia, or you know, discriminatory, hateful messages against women, and so on and so forth. These companies are private clubs that can make and do make their own rules, but those rules have so far been mostly driven by commercial interests. And so the curation of information that goes on an ongoing basis is done with commercial interests in mind. Allowing, you know, multiple voices, the endless claims we heard from people like Mark Zuckerberg that they didn't want to be the arbiters of truth, so to say, really reflected this hands-off approach that the bulk of big tech corporations took for a very long time. Now, I think there was a bit of a reckoning or turnaround, not because of political concerns necessarily, but because of the spread of COVID disinformation, the selling of all kinds of stuff on platforms like Amazon that were obviously unsubstantiated scientifically, whether it would be dysfunctional face masks, whether it was the spiking in prices of disinfectants, whether it was books that actually share conspiracy theories or lies about the COVID pandemic and alleged, you know, cures for it. And so you could really see that on these big tech platforms, whether it be information or goods that were sold, there was a real risk to public health. And that's where I want to pick up this question of, is this a freedom of expression discussion? It's not. It's more than a freedom of expression discussion. And by sort of dogmatically keeping it in the realm of freedom of expression in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, there's a denying of the notion that there's actually a competition or clashing of rights. The need to protect freedom of expression, which is key, but also the need to preserve public health or public order and safety, as we saw when people started storming the US Capitol, inspired by online spreading of messages, at least as part of what motivated them to storm the Capitol and to be prepared, to be trained, to bring arms, and so on and so forth. So the singular focus on freedom of expression cannot deal with these multitude of issues that are typically the domain of public policy. You know, where does public health become risked, or when is there a problem with protecting public health as a result of principally free expression? Because I don't think there's many people who will say, well, anti-vaxxers don't have a right to free speech. I think what they're saying is technically legal. It certainly is in the United States, but it can still be harmful. And it's the same for all kinds of hateful, polarizing content, where you could say, look, you know, a lot of speech is strictly speaking not illegal, but if it leads to attacks on Asian Americans, or if it leads to conspiracy theories floating to the very top when it's about, you know, the Parkland High School shooting, for example, then we do have a problem. And I think that problem comes from the business models that are behind the information architecture that so many people rely on, but that we know too little about. It is incredibly difficult. We're talking here about, you know, where science can inspire policymaking. This is where the crux of the matter is. It is hard. I was a policymaker for 10 years to get to the core of what is actually going on, facilitated by Facebook's ever-changing algorithms, or Alphabet, Google's constantly evolving search algorithms, or YouTube that, you know, stays out of scrutiny for its facilitating of anti-vaxxers, conspiracy theorists, hate speech, and so on and so forth. And so without independent scientific research into these big tech platforms, fact-based policymaking and lawmaking become more difficult. And so I worry when we now have spent the last week on assessing whether a handpicked group of experts judging over a handpicked set of questions about whether Facebook did or did not make the right decision doesn't really distract us from these fundamental questions of why there's not more systematic, scalable, independent oversight over these big tech platforms that are advertising giants, but that are building the information architecture that a lot of people rely on for news, for contacting their friends, for information about public health and their public interest. And I don't think it's a sustainable model to say, you know, because Facebook has designed a set of people that they are pretending are like a Supreme Court or some kind of judiciary, that is actually what it is, because it's not. And so I hope that it's not a distraction from those bigger, more fundamental questions about transparency and accountability in the rule of law sense of the word, and that is where we should all focus.
Yeah, that was a really, really good answer to my loaded question that had many facets. So thank you very much for touching on all of those parts. And I was thinking about, you know, how difficult it is to reverse engineer these algorithms when the companies don't want you to do that, right? And how hard it is for scientists to actually produce good evidence about what is happening in these systems and how is it affecting people. And we know that, you know, Facebook is running experiments on its user base and with potentially quite disastrous effects for the individuals who may have been affected, and those sort of just get buried as well. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff to think about there. There's something that you touched on.
Treatment of children, I should add, you know, experimenting and paying children, proposing to have an Instagram for underage kids. I mean, there seem to be no limits, moral limits to the kinds of rollouts of the business model. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. Yeah, absolutely. And so you mentioned scientific and technology advice or evidence. And I was wondering, when you were an MEP, there would have been many discussions and debates that needed to be informed by this type of evidence. And so on a very practical level, what were the most effective ways for you to engage with scientific evidence and for somebody who has scientific evidence to engage with you?
Well, it's a great question. And I don't know if there's one sort of magic avenue, but I would say that it's incredibly important, and I cannot stress enough, for those independent scientific academic voices to be heard by politicians and by policymakers at large. And so what I hope academics will do, because academics are as diverse as the types of topics that are on the political agenda, is that they will be inspired and feel called to actually make their research available, and to think hard and maybe even work with others to unlock it, in the sense of, the depth and the rigor of scientific research does not always make it, easily accessible for generalists that politicians normally are. And for example, one part of someone's academic research may be very relevant for a new legislative proposal that's on the table. It would help to then take that, analytical academic work and try to package it in a way, present it in a way, make it available in a way that is accessible for policymakers. And so that will often mean, in the mind of an academic, to simplify it or to summarize it in a way that wouldn't pass the academic standards, but that are sufficient to bring across the information to a policymaker. And I think that should be the aim of bridging the gap between the worlds of science and the worlds of policymaking. And oftentimes there will be either sort of policy labs in universities. I see that at the University of Amsterdam, where there's an international law and policy lab, which really tries to translate, ideas of international law to policy relevant recommendations, and vice versa, notably in the space of digitization, privacy protection. But, in fields where I'm not at all an expert, agriculture or transportation or education, I'm sure that lawmakers could really benefit from all kinds of insights that have been gained by scientists. And I hope that through professional organizations or through their own networks, there will also be attention at the universities of the values of making policy briefs. I started a series of policy briefs at Stanford, at the Institute for Human-Centered AI, where we really proactively consider ourselves those interpreters, for lack of a better term, between the scientists on the one hand and the policymakers on the other hand.
Yeah, and I'm interested in those different roles that you've played in the policy ecosystem over the course of your career. So you've been an MEP inside government, and now you're a research fellow, which is nominally an academic position, trying to influence what governments do. So what are the differences in how you make change happen between those two roles? And what feels more effective to you? I guess the reason that I'm asking is, as a young person who maybe wants to make a difference in the digital policy space, should that young person try to become a politician, or should they be an academic, or should they be something else if they really want to affect some change in this space?
Well, I fundamentally believe that people should do what they're primarily driven by, so that there's no, external magic answer that I can give in terms of what direction people should take. But there is a set of roles that kind of meet the middle of what you're describing. And I would say policy advisors or legislative advisors to politicians are a great role for ambitious, analytical people that are young, that like working hard, but that are not only motivated by the rigor of academia, but also inspired to be part of the change that they believe in, that have this kind of drive to see their ideals materialize. And I see a lot of those people in my classes at Stanford. I've met a lot of people that were at universities or, in other kinds of studies around the EU when I was a member of European Parliament, around the world, in fact, because we would engage, globally. And I believe that the public interest would be tremendously served if those people would choose to look for roles in government or in public institutions, in democratic institutions. And sometimes, let's be realistic, it means a lower paycheck than what one could earn in the private sector. I've stood before that choice myself when I left politics. I could have gone for much more lucrative jobs with private sector organizations, and I deliberately chose not to. And I think it is incredibly fulfilling to be independent, the way I am now at Stanford. It may be less directly influential than being a member of the European Parliament, because of course the power of a vote is still a unique one. It's hard to equate, successful research with one decisive vote. But I was also very interested to, reinvent myself and not get stuck, so to say, in a role that I, got to know over 10 years. I could have stayed in for the next decade, but I saw a lot of people become gradually more cynical by staying in the same place. And also inevitably, and not deliberately so, but, struggling to keep a sense of perspective. Once you're in any kind of world for too long, it doesn't matter what job it is. It's not unique to politics. Everybody ends up in a bit of a bubble of sorts, a professional bubble. And I thought it was healthy to break that bubble, to go into a different one, from the political one to the Silicon Valley one, which, no doubt is another bubble, and to study it, to take time to go more in depth, because the pace of politics doesn't always allow for that. Even if there are files that you work on for years and you do end up really being an expert in, it's hard to find the time to really concentrate on some, bigger developments, how they all relate. You really have to spend your energy on the files that are before you, and I can't say whether one profession is better than the other. I have and I do enjoy both very much, but I've personally found it very rewarding to take that different perspective, to work with young people in the university, and to get to know the echelons of power in Silicon Valley, which is, I look at technology and the companies there through the lens of power, and I see that there's a real need for the type of countervailing measures that we know in politics, that we know in democracy, the types of checks and balances, the kinds of debates, the kinds of questioning of whether a proposal is good enough, what the societal impact might be, not just what the industrial impact would be. And so it's interesting to look through the lens of power and through the lens of democracy at what's happening in Silicon Valley, and to try to change it for the better.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating to hear a bit more about your journey. And how you went through these different roles to land where you are now. I think it is reassuring that people don't become politicians and then stay politicians forever, that there are ways for them to then get out and contribute to society in different ways, and to still have that sort of impact, but through a different lens. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for joining us and sharing some of those insights. And thank you to the audience for listening or watching. We hope that you'll join us for the next installment of the INGSA Horizon series. Thank you very much.
Thank you.